There's a story of a famous biochemist who used to travel around the country giving lectures. These were in the days before the internet, so nobody could go online and see what he looked like. But he did have a reputation that preceded him. He had published some books. And there was a college student who needed a part-time job. He actually hired himself out as the personal chauffeur for this biochemist. And of course, one of the advantages to having an itinerant speaking engagement around the country is you can always give the same message, and you're the only one knowing you're giving the same message every time. Except for this student who had to sit in the back and listen to him so that he could drive him on to his next appointment. One night, while they were driving to the next gig, he said to him, "Sir, even though I know very little about science and absolutely nothing about biochemistry, I'm more in the arts at school, I have heard you give that lecture so many times that I could get up and pretend I'm you and give the exact same talk. He said, not only could I repeat what you said word for word, I could use all your voice inflections, all your expressions, and make myself sound just exactly like you." Well, of course, the chemist was kind of intrigued with this. He says, "Well, these people don't know what I look like. For all they know, I might be some childhood genius prodigy college student." He says, "We're about the same height. Let's try an experiment. Let's change clothes. I'm going to put on your chauffeur's uniform. I'm going to give you my coat and tie, and I want to see you get up there, and I'm going to sit in the back, and I want to listen to you give that lecture." So they did it, and it worked splendidly. Sure enough, he repeated it word for word, all the same tones, all the same expressions, all the same voice inflections. It could not have gone better until he finished, and a gentleman in the second row raised his hand to ask a question. Not only did this kid not know the answer, he didn't even understand what the question was. He had to think fast on his feet. Something finally came to him, and he looked at him and said, "Sir, I am shocked and amazed and astonished that a man of your education and credentials and caliber could ask a question so basic that even my chauffeur sitting in the back of the room could come up here and answer the question for me." Well, today we're going to talk about the events following the resurrection of Christ. These are events obviously crucial for Christians, events doubted by skeptics. Now, I shared that illustration for a reason, because it says something about doubt. There are many people with many sincere doubts about Christianity, and that's fine. But there's also such a thing as insincere doubt. Sometimes, without taking the time to look into an issue, people still talk, like this kid, as if they are experts. It says in the Bible, the fool isn't interested in learning, only in expressing his opinion. Now, I got to tell you, that was me back in college. I wasn't brought up in the church. I was raised as a liberal Jewish atheist. That meant I was a Jew culturally, but not religiously. I didn't believe in the New Testament, but I really didn't believe in the Old Testament either. Didn't believe in any God at all. That's the way I was brought up. When I was in my second year of college, a new organization broke out called Jews for Jesus. And I saw a poster, and I was absolutely enraged. I thought they were traitors. Now, mind you, I knew nothing, again, about Judaism or Christianity, but that didn't keep me from expressing my opinion and opening my big, stupid mouth. I'm not much of an artist, but I got some construction paper and some felt pens, and I made a poster. I was very proud of it. And I stuck it up right next to the Jews for Jesus poster, and my poster said, "How about people for people?" I thought that was just brilliant and philosophical on my part. But if somebody had asked me what I meant, I wouldn't have known what to tell them. I did not know what I was talking about. Well, I wanted to start with myself because I am going to be critiquing some Christian skeptics today, people skeptical of Christianity. And that doesn't mean I don't love these people. As a matter of fact, I have a very special love for the unsaved and the honest seeker. I like good questions. But there's also such a thing as tough love. And at times, to truly, honestly help people, we need to point out their groundless arguments. And that's why, to be fair, I started with a lame argument that I once gave. It helps me to be patient with people when I remember that I once walked in their shoes, when I remember that I once said a lot of the same things. For 5 years, I did a ministry at UC Santa Barbara, a campus ministry. Now, at that time, the campus boasted as having the greatest religious studies department in the country. But it was liberal religious studies. One of the biggest mistakes parents make when they send their kids to a secular college is they encourage them to take a religious studies class thinking that will strengthen their faith. It'll actually do the opposite. Let me show you what it's like the first day of a religious studies class. The professor gets up and says, now we're not here to critique religions. What he means is we're not here to critique any religion except Christianity. He says, we're not here to judge religions. We're not here to put religions down. What he means is we're not here to judge or put down any religion other than Christianity. On the day they talk about Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, it's a beautiful religion. We all should be open. There are things we could learn from them. On the day they get to the Bible, the Bible contradicts itself. It's been rewritten. It's been mistranslated. If some Christian dare tries to defend the Bible in class, whoa, buddy, separation between church and state. You can't preach in here. Of course, him talking about Christianity and criticizing it, that, of course, doesn't violate the separation between church and state. So we used to put up an information table on this campus. It was a great way of meeting students and engaging them. We had literature, but honestly, the literature was just there as a buffer zone. It was a way for them to come and look around and not feel intimidated like they had to immediately engage us. But eventually, most of them did talk to us, and we had great conversations. Sometimes people coming out of one of these religious studies classes, they were all pumped up, and they just couldn't wait to meet some dumb Christian and teach him and show him a thing or two. One day, a lady walked up, an undergrad. She walked right up to our table and she starts in, it is an established fact, now, right there, before I even go on. Whenever I hear somebody that emphatic that they've got a fact, I know I'm not about to hear a fact. I know I'm not to hear anything that even remotely resembles a fact. But we were polite. We let her continue. It is an established fact that Jesus Christ never claimed to be God incarnate, never claimed to be the Son of God, never did any miracles, never said or taught anything original. He was a member of the Essene community, and he just repeated whatever they taught. Now, if you've never heard of the Essenes, they actually were kind of a Jewish cult that did exist at the time of Jesus. They annexed themselves from the rest of Israel, went up into the wilderness, and started kind of a commune. We got the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Essenes. You've probably heard of those. So she's making the claim that Jesus Christ was an Essene. I asked her a very simple question. I said, how do you know? How do you know he was an Essene? She says, well, I just heard that 5 minutes ago from my religious studies professor. That's how I know. I was supposed to fall out of my chair. Whoa, jumping Jiminy, you heard it from your professor? You didn't explain it like that. But I didn't do that. I just asked her another question. How does he know? How do you know that he knows? She says, well, he has a PhD in Christian studies. I assume he knows what he's talking about. I said, that's a big assumption. I could show you other people that have doctorates in Christian studies, in archaeology, in textual criticism, in ancient history, and they'll tell you something completely different. I said, as a matter of fact, I've studied this era intensely myself, and I can guarantee you there is no document that's ever been discovered on any archaeological expedition that exists in any museum which says Jesus Christ was an Essene. If you think you know of such a document, I'd like you to tell me where I could find it, because I'd honestly like to go take a look at it. Then she did what's called altering the premise of the argument. It's very common. She goes, oh, well, if we're going to talk about history, we don't know that Jesus Christ ever even lived at all, for that matter. I said, well, if we don't know that he lived at all, then how do you know for an established fact that he was an Essene? Another time, same campus, this guy comes up to me, you Christians are so stupid. Walking around with your little Bibles, believing everything you read. Just because something's written in a book, that doesn't make it true. Besides, he goes on to tell me, we know for a fact, here we're going to hear it again, another fact, we know for a fact that the Genesis story is a myth. I said, oh, we know the Genesis story is a myth, do we? How do we know that? He stopped, he smiled, he took off his backpack, he pulled out his science textbook, he turned to the second chapter, he slammed his finger on the page. There you have it, black and white. I said, just because something's written in a book, that doesn't necessarily make it true. Do you believe everything you read? Well, it goes without saying that those who doubt the Bible are certainly going to doubt the events associated with the resurrection because they're talked about in the Bible. Now, the Bible's not the only history from ancient times and ancient literature which talks about this, and I'll refer to that more in a few moments. But in those days immediately following the resurrection, God verified the resurrection. The Apostle Paul summarized this when he wrote to the Corinthians. I'm reading from 1 Corinthians 15. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. So how did God go about verifying this? He did it in several ways. First of all, by making it as verifiable as any other event in history. Now what happens, people always say, well, we don't have a time machine, so we can't go back and prove that the resurrection happened. That is true of all history. If that's going to be your criteria, you've just thrown out all history. We are trusting some type of historian or eyewitness. Let me tell you something. If the same amount of people who claim that Jesus rose from the dead simply claimed that a man named Jesus in 33 AD gave a speech, or a man named Jesus started a revolution, nobody would doubt it. The problem is we have this immediate bias because we do not accept miracles. Whether or not miracles are possible is a valid discussion in the realms of philosophy and science. They don't belong in a historical discussion, though. The historical discipline simply says, how many witnesses were there? Were they credible? What was the reputation of the ancient historians who reported it? However, let's move to the field of science for just a second and talk about miracles, since this is an issue with people. You need to understand, when the Bible says that God does a miracle, they don't mean that God waves his wand like a magician and throws science out the window. God established all scientific law. He simply does his miracles with the scientific laws that we don't yet know. Human beings probably know less than 1% of all the obtainable knowledge in the universe. So how does God do his miracles? With the 99.9% of the knowledge that we don't yet have. Can you imagine somebody 1,000 years ago or even 100 years ago looking at today's technology, watching you take out your iPad or your cell phone with these little dancing images, seeing airplanes, seeing rocket ships? That would look like something impossible to them. We look at that and we go, well, no, it's not impossible. It's very scientific. It's just that we have harnessed science that they did not yet have. Likewise, if you imagine human beings 100 or 1,000 years in the future, don't we just assume, when we see how much technology changes every year, don't we just assume that someday human beings are going to do things that baffle our minds? They're going to do things which, if we saw them now, we wouldn't have a clue how they were being done. But we assume that they're being done according to some kind of science. So we should not throw out miracles. Miracles are possible. The $50 million question is, what kind of historical testimony do we have? Now, here are the historical facts related to the resurrection. We know for a fact that a man named Jesus Christ was executed by the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. We know that there was a rumor that Jesus was going to rise from the dead. He had claimed he would. His enemies were afraid, not that he'd really rise, obviously they didn't believe in him, but it did occur to them that maybe his disciples could steal the body and fake it and spread this rumor. So he was buried in a very unusual way. He was buried in what was called a sepulcher. This was like a hollowed out cave with something like a great big boulder rolled in front of it. And they hired some Roman guards. And this boulder had a Roman seal on it. That was a legal marked. The penalty for breaking a Roman seal was death. And the soldiers watched it 24 hours, all through the weekend, each 24 hours. The Romans would sleep in shifts. Only 6 could sleep at a time. There were usually 12 that were awake. Those were the circumstances, and then there's one more circumstance. 3 days later, on Sunday morning, his body was found missing. So what are the different possibilities? There's very few possibilities of what might have happened. One is that maybe the disciples came by night and stole the body. If you read the Gospel of Matthew, you find that the Roman soldiers try to float that one because they're afraid of getting into trouble with this missing body on their watch. So they threw that out. The disciples came by night while we were sleeping and stole the body. Well, first of all, as I just told you, that's impossible because of the way they slept and kept some of them awake. But let's just humor people for a moment. Supposing it happened that way. They're claiming the disciples came while they were sleeping. Well, if they were sleeping, how do they know it was the disciples? They were asleep. If they were awake, why didn't they stop them? This was Rome. Rome, they had conquered the entire Western world. They had enough on the ball to guard one dead body. So the next theory is, well, maybe the Romans themselves stole it. They didn't give a hang about Jewish religion. They just didn't want to lose their lives for not doing their duty. Once again, that was behind a Roman seal. What possible reason would they have to risk their lives to perpetrate some Jewish religion that they didn't care about? Then another possibility that comes out is, well, maybe the Jewish religious leaders themselves just stole the body. They were the ones that wanted to make sure it was guarded so that nobody could steal the body. But then they're going to steal it themselves? And if they had, when you read the book of Acts, you notice they were very upset when people were running out into the streets claiming Jesus rose from the dead. Peter and John were brought before this Jewish puppet court under the Romans and commanded not to preach this anymore. They could have stopped this dead in its tracks. Hey, he didn't rise from the dead. We'll prove it. Here's his body. Everybody knew what Jesus looked like. He came out at the time of the Passover. That was a big time. He was the most popular guy in town. They knew what he looked like. They could have stopped him dead in its tracks. Look, here's his body. He didn't rise from the dead. Why didn't they show the body? They didn't have the body. Another theory that's somewhat popular, it's called the swoon theory. This one you really have to use your imagination for. This says that Jesus took a drug which simulated death because Jesus wanted to fake everybody out. So it's like the story of Romeo and Juliet. There's that drug that simulates death. They did have drugs like that in those days, but use your imagination now. So he's put into this cave with a boulder rolled in front. He's wrapped up almost like a mummy. He gets up. Now, he's just been crucified. Could you survive a crucifixion? Well, no. You could maybe last a day or two. You're going to die really soon, but is it possible that a day later he was still alive? Yeah. That's possible, but he wouldn't have been in the best of shape. It was the most torturous form of execution known to the world at that time. So imagine this crucified Jesus. He gets up, the drug wears off. Hey, it's working. He unravels the cloth, single-handedly pushes a boulder after having been crucified, mind you, and then single-handedly fights off at least 6, maybe 12 Roman soldiers and makes his escape. Folks, if he could have done all that, he might as well just have risen from the dead. It would have been just as much of a miracle. Another very interesting thing that God did, and we don't always think about that, he saw to it that Jesus appeared to the women first. Now, why would God have done that? You know, the Bible is frequently accused of being a chauvinistic book. It's not true that the Bible is a chauvinistic book, but I'll tell you what is true. The Bible does come out of a very patriarchal, chauvinistic culture. That was the culture of the Jews, the culture of the Greeks, and the culture of the Romans. If these guys were trying to perpetrate some kind of myth, it would not have been very smart of them to write in the narrative that he appeared to the women first, because to their fellow citizens of Israel, that would have looked like a very weak argument. If he was really important, if he was really the Messiah, why would he have appeared to the women? Why were they so painstakingly accurate, even to the point of putting themselves down? Luke 24 says, but they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Why did they write it that way then? Because that's what really happened. Because if God rose somebody from the dead, they figured they better be accurate in how they're reporting it. Another thing that God did is he allowed the historical documents of other sources outside the New Testament to corroborate it. Now, this doesn't mean the New Testament isn't accurate historically. The New Testament isn't really one book. It's a collection of 27 different historical documents, and there are many archaeologists who have verified them. But nevertheless, if you tell your friends Jesus rose from the dead, here's the way, I get into dialogues with skeptics all the time. Here's the way they usually set it up. They say, if Christ really rose from the dead, if that really happened, if he really did miracles in his life before rising from the dead, a lot of people should have noticed. And we go, well, yeah, a lot of people did notice. And they wrote it down. We call it the Gospels. Yeah, but that doesn't count. Oh, why doesn't that count? Because those people knew Jesus. They loved Jesus. They were his friends. They were biased. Okay, now bias does get into history. Let's admit that. But it gets into all history. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England during World War II, has written a book called The Second World War. It's a multi-volume set. Now, do we think Winston Churchill had an unbiased view of World War II? Who was right, Germany or England? Probably not. But it always depends on how we phrase the question. Let me ask you another question. What historian in his right mind would be uninterested in a book about World War II written by Winston Churchill? You see how they set this up? If Jesus really rose from the dead, if he really did miracles, people should have written about it. But the people that knew him best, followed him for 3 years, ate with him, slept next to him, they don't count. We would never set any other historical event up to that kind of scrutiny. Be that as it may, we do have some documentation that does not come from Christians. One of them is from the Talmud. Now, that was an oral interpretation of the law in Jesus' day. It's since been codified. The Talmud paints a very unflattering picture of Jesus. In fact, they call him a sorcerer, and they call him an apostate. An apostate is a heretic. Now, why do they call him? But they do mention that he was executed, and they say he was executed on the charge of apostasy and sorcery. Why do they call him an apostate? Well, for an ancient Jew to claim to be the God of Israel, let alone the God of the entire universe, that was as heretical as heresy gets, unless he happened to be telling the truth, and he really was God, but they didn't believe that. So we can understand why they call him an apostate. What I find intriguing is that they also referred to him as a sorcerer. Why? Because in those days, if you didn't like somebody and you wanted to discourage people from following him, but you still couldn't deny that he had done many miracles, you just said, oh, well, yeah, sure, he did miracles, but he didn't do them by the power of God. He did them by the power of Satan. So what we have here is we may not like the fact that they're insulting Jesus, but historically, you see how this is great news. We have this fantastic ancient source predisposed with a bias against Jesus, which nevertheless assumes that Jesus lived, was executed, and did miracles. It gets even better. Josephus, the historian, he was Jewish, but he lived in Rome and wrote his history for the Romans. He was not a Christian. He took only a casual interest in Jesus. We would have expected him to take more interest if he was a Christian. Nevertheless, in his section on the deeds of Pontius Pilate, his judgments, his trials, to be thorough, to be comprehensive, he includes this very brief passage. It says, now about this time, Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure, he drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again at the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day. That is not in the New Testament, and that was not written by a Christian. Now, you might be thinking, if we have such great evidence, how come this gets dismissed? Well, it's easy. People try to have their cake and they eat it too. They go, oh, well, the real Josephus never wrote that. You see, the writings of Josephus, we don't have the originals. We only have copies. That's true of all ancient history. Once again, if copies are a problem, they had to copy things in those days. The printing press hadn't been invented yet. You couldn't save it on your hard drive. You copied it or it didn't survive. So they're claiming, okay, it was copied. So Christians over the years went in and they tampered with it. And I go, well, the manuscript tradition that we have, it's there in all those manuscripts of Antiquities 18. So how do you know the Christians tampered with it? There's nothing external to bring us to that conclusion. They go, well, because he claimed Jesus rose from the dead. Only a Christian would claim he rose from the dead. I said, dude, you just set it up that way. You just told me yourself if this really happened, we should see a historian other than Christians claiming he rose from the dead. I just give you exactly what you asked for, and now you say you have to dismiss it. By the way, Josephus was a Pharisee. They believed in resurrections. It was possible to believe somebody resurrected. I once interviewed the radio talk show host Michael Medved on my radio show, Orthodox Jew. I asked him his opinion of Jesus. He said he thought there was a really good chance that Jesus rose from the dead. He also told me that even if he was convinced, he wouldn't become a Christian. So there's nothing in Josephus's words here that force them to become a Christian. We're giving them exactly what they want, and they're saying that's not good enough. There was another ancient writer named Tacitus. He didn't like Christianity at all, but he was writing about the great fire of Rome, which Emperor Nero tried to blame on Christians. In fact, Nero was the first persecution from a Roman emperor toward Christianity. So to be thorough, he went and investigated the imperial archives of the trial of Pontius Pilate, and he came to this conclusion about Christianity. He says their originator, Christ, had been executed in Tiberius's reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, but in spite of this temporary setback, the deadly superstition had broken out afresh, not only in Judea, where the mischief had started, but even in Rome. All degraded and shameful practices collect and flourish in the capital. You can see this guy is not a Christian. It's degraded, it's shameful, it's a superstition. But here's what's interesting. Notice these words. That stopped the superstition. The death of Christ stopped the superstition, but it broke out again. If the death of Christ stopped the miraculous, the claims of the miraculous, what would it take for it to break out again? He's obviously referring to the claims Christ rose from the dead, although he personally does not believe those claims. We also have a document called the Acts of Pilate. This was both an official record of his trial, and Pilate was so overwhelmed by the events of the resurrection, he actually became a Christian and wrote a letter to Emperor Tiberius. Emperor Tiberius was so moved by his letter, he went to the Roman Senate and asked them to classify Jesus as a Roman god, which shows obviously a real ignorance and misunderstanding of who Jesus was, but it also shows how compelling that letter is. Now, there is one problem. This document, the Acts of Pilate, has been lost. Okay, we don't have it in our possession, but before you think that's a big problem, what we do have in our possession is 4 other ancient documents which refer to it. One of them I just mentioned because I told you Tacitus would not have written what he wrote about the trial under Pilate without first going to the imperial archives and checking that out. But this document is also coined by its name. In the 2nd century, there was a Christian apologist named Justin Martyr. An apologist is one who defends Christianity both intellectually and morally. In those days, they were mostly defending it morally because Christians were being accused of being enemies of the state, enemies of Rome. So he writes a letter to Antoninus Pius, and he mostly is assuring him we're not your enemies, but he also talks about miracles Christ did. And he says, sir, if you have any doubt, go to the archives and look at the Acts of Pilate. And he calls that document by name. Now, what moron is going to say that to a Roman emperor who could have him killed if he isn't absolutely positive that that document exists when the emperor goes to check it out? The resurrection, however, continues to sustain our relationship with God all the way up to the present day. God still does miracles. You don't read about them in the New York Times, but God still does miracles. I was led to Christ in college by a guy named Roger Cousins. A number of years ago, Roger called me on the phone. His wife, Vivian, had gone in for an x-ray, and on Vivian's uterus, they found some kind of clot. They didn't know if it was cancerous. They didn't know if it was benign. Roger just asked me to pray. Well, about a week later, I called him back to ask what the prognosis was. He says, when they went in and took a second picture, it was gone. He says, it's not that it was benign, it was just gone. For people that ask for evidence, I want it right in front of me. Here we have picture A, picture B, right there. He said, Bob, my doctor is an atheist. We've gotten into it many times. He said, as an atheist, in my professional opinion, this was a miracle. Now, we have that all the time in the medical community, but they only say in confidence to somebody it's a miracle. That's not what they write in their journal. They write cause of recovery unknown, because that just sounds better, right? But it was a miracle. Perhaps, though, the greatest miracle is the relationship that God offers with you, no matter what you've done. Jesus died for all sins, including yours. One of the difficult messages, and this would be a message for another time, is the whole doctrine of hell. But I have found that if people were not personally worried that they were going to hell, it would not concern them as much. And that's one of the things I'll say to a skeptic. If you knew you weren't going to hell, would this bother you as much? Because sometimes people think, okay, yeah, God forgives sin, sure, nobody's perfect, but I've done something so heinous. There's no way he's forgiven me. A number of years ago, I was teaching in Denver at the Campus Ambassador Summer Institute, and one evening, one of the college students, a woman, came up to me. And as we talked, it turned out that she'd had sex outside of marriage, had lived a promiscuous lifestyle, but she'd heard me say that God forgives everything and doesn't hold a person's past against them. And she just said, you've been saying all week, God forgives everything. And then she said it again. She goes, everything? And then she started crying. And I said, yes, everything. And then we talked and we assured her. I want to give you that same assurance today. You may think there's something you've done or said that has alienated you from God. Jesus loves you so much. When he was dying on the cross, he was actually thinking about you. If you have not given your life to Christ, it's a very simple step. In fact, so as simple as the ABCs, and we call it the ABCs of salvation here at Skyline. First, A, admit you are a sinner. B, believe that Jesus died for your sin and rose from the dead. And then C, choose to follow him. Let's pray together. We're not going to ask you to do anything. We're not going to ask you to raise your hand. We're not going to ask you to come forward. But just repeat this prayer with me if this prayer resonates with your heart. God, if you do exist, if there is a way that I can have a relationship with you through Jesus, then I want it. Thank you that Jesus died on the cross for my sin. Thank you that Jesus rose from the dead. I pray that I can have this relationship with Jesus so that I too may someday rise and go to heaven. I ask in the meantime that your Spirit come into my heart, not only to change my actions, but my thoughts, my motives, my feelings, things that could not change if you do not do a miracle in my heart. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.